Now let's suppose that you click on this update button. What I want to do is I want to fill all these values inside these input text boxes, so we can easily update the user without specifying the same values again inside these text boxes. So what we need to do is we need to first get the values from the database and then specify that to all these text boxes. So inside this update form right here, let me close all these forms. Now inside this update form here at the top, I'm going to first get the data from the database. I'm going to get the user with the user ID. As you know, when you click on this button, it's going to pass the user ID to this form ID variable. I'm going to get that user using this form ID. So before this handle submit right here, I'm going to say use query, and I'm going to import that use query at the top right here. And inside this parenthesis, I want to call this helper function, get user. This get user function is going to return a single user as a response from this function. And this function is going to take a parameter called user ID. As you know, inside this form ID, we have the user ID. So using this use query, I'm going to fetch that value and store that in the variable. So inside this use query, I'm going to first specify the tag name, which is users. Then I'm going to pass here comma, and then as a second argument, I'm going to call here a function get user from the helper file. So from this lib helper file, I'm going to get this get user and then pass here as a second argument, something like this. And then I want to pass this form ID something like this. But this statement won't execute. This is because if you want to pass any external value to this use query, you need to pass that value as an array to the first argument. So if you want to pass this form ID to this get user, you have to wrap this statement inside an array, something like this. And on the second index, you specify this form ID. And now instead of this get user, you call here a callback function like this and call get user. Now this statement is going to return the single object as a response, and we are going to get that object by destructuring it. So I'm going to say here constant in the object. Here I'm going to say is loading, is error, data, and error. So you can get all these properties from this use query. Now just out of that, right down here, I'm going to get rid of this object, and here I'm going to say if is loading. If it is a loading message, then I'm going to return a division tag with the message loading. And if it is an error, so is error is going to be return, and then specify here div with that error. You can specify your own errors here. That's upon you. At the top, I'm going to say constant in the object from this data. As you know, inside this data, we have an object. So I'm going to destructure all the values here. I can say here data. Inside this object, I can say name. From this object, you can get name, avatar, salary, date, email, and status. So we are destructuring all these values from this data variable. Let me just grab this statement and specify that above here. And just after that, as you know, instead of just name, here I have two values, first name and last name. So we need to grab first name and last name from this name property. So right down here, I'm going to say constant in the array. I'm going to say first name and last name, and I'm going to get that from the name property. We need to call here a function dot split. This function is used to split string and return as an array. So I'm going to pass here empty space. So this statement is going to return an array of first name and last name, and I'm going to store that values inside these variables. Now what if I don't have any value inside this name? In that case, I want to get these values from this form data. So let me specify here name. So let's suppose that if I have name, then I'm going to execute this statement. Otherwise, if I don't have this name, then I'm going to specify here form data. So I'm going to get this name from this form data. Just after that, I want to specify these values to the text boxes. So right down here on change, so the set form function is going to specify all the values of these input text boxes to this form data. Now what I want, instead of on change, I want to get these values from the database. So as you know, we already have these values inside this variable. So right down here, I'm just going to specify that to this input text box. So I'm going to say here default value is going to be first name. So the default value of this input text box is this first name. Let me copy this, specify that here. So I'm going to specify here a variable last name, then specify this to this email. Here I'm going to say email, then copy and paste this default value here. This is for salary. Do the same for this date. Here I'm going to say date, and do the same for this active and this inactive radio buttons. So instead of default value, here you specify default check. So I'm going to say default check is equal to, in the curly braces, I'm going to say if the status is equal to active, then I'm going to check this input text box. Otherwise, return false. So this statement is going to return true or false value to this default check. I'm going to copy this and specify that to the second radio checkbox. And here I'm going to say if the status is not equal to active, then return true. Back to the form. And now when I click on this update button, you're not going to get anything. But if you click on this update again, you can see you have all the values of your database inside these text boxes. If I click on the second record, you will get all the values of the second record inside these text boxes. So you can easily update your record by clicking on this update button. So what I want, when I click on this update button, instantly I want to open the update form and specify all these values to these input text boxes. So we can easily update the user. So we are going to achieve this using Redux middleware. So let me show you how you can use Redux middleware in this application.